deep in the black water veins of southern Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs like a judgment, a secret breathes beneath the cypress roots. In the year 1863, as distant cannons reshaped the map of a country, an older, more private violence unfolded in the dark heart of Belmont Plantation. There, among sugar-cane rows and lacquered parlor mirrors, a ceremony was planned that the polite registers of history would pretend never existed. Cornelius Thibodeaux, the patriarch of that estate, announced he would wed his own granddaughter, Celeste Marie, now a young woman of 21, schooled in 3 tongues, sharpened by suspicion, and heir to a fortune that tied her to him by law and blood. What you are about to hear crawled out of burned courthouses, escaped the lockboxes of private vaults, and slithered through the whispered corridors of Creole drawing rooms. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If you feel the pull of this story, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Your location anchors the tale to a real world that still remembers. Records, charters, and a scorched ledger found after the Vermilion Parish fire give us only fragments, but those shards cut deep a pattern of calculated cruelty, a network of secrecy that touched judges, physicians, and men who moved like shadows through both plantation aisles and antebellum salons. Belmont was not simply an estate, it was a monument to old money and older superstitions, a place where legalese and ritual braided together until intent was indistinguishable from law. Cornelius wore black as if he dressed for perpetual mourning. His face bore the long scar of a duel and the longer patience of a man who believed history had ordained his right. The family name carried weight, but behind the weight there was a doctrine, a private covenant that said blood must remain unbroken and power must be preserved at all costs. Hidden beneath his collar was a silver medallion, a token worn by a fellowship older than the town records. Men who called themselves guardians of a pure line, who traded conscience for continuity. They whispered of an ancestral force and argued that marriages among kin were rituals of restoration rather than crimes. To them, Belmont's survival justified any horror. To Cornelius, horror had become an instrument of governance. Cornelius presented his argument not as a plea but as a legal liturgy. He unfurled a faded charter, the script curled like dried seaweed, and read in a voice that transformed clause into command. The provision he cited was ancient, threaded into the plantation's founding documents like a parasite in times of peril. The patriarch could enact measures to ensure the continuity of the line. To any ear unfamiliar with the old ways, the clause sounded monstrous. To the initiated it sounded like salvation. Etienne Boudreau, the overseer, sat opposite him, feeling the room tilt. Boudreau had long taken orders without questioning the violence that followed, but this pronouncement made even his stony face falter. Cornelius's calmness was the kind built on centuries of precedent, on grafted traditions and the insurance of silence. He spoke of duty as a ledger that balanced more than accounts, and when he mentioned the name of the society, Le Gardien du Sang-Peur, Boudreau's jaw tightened. The silver medallions the society's members wore were small mirrors of entitlement. They reflected a world where laws could be read and bent to fit desire. Neighbors noted the announcement like a gust of rotten air. Letters arrived from families who relied on circuit and reputation, some pleading, others veiledly complicit. The Creole drawing rooms that once hummed with gossip now crackled with fear, and a handful of men who had made social order their religion studied lines of legal text they had hoped never to open. Celeste watched all of this with a kind of terrible discipline. She had been formed in the quiet economy of observation, ledger-keeping, correspondence, the minute business of a household that kept secrets like ledgers keep debts. Her parents' deaths had been catalogued as misfortune, a carriage accident, a tragic drowning blamed on the chaos of war. But the documents she later found suggested a different accounting. Late-night entries crossed out and rewritten, payments moved in ways that made the family's fortunes disappear into other hands, notes that suggested threats and silences. She began to piece together a ledger of motives, gambling debts hidden behind charitable donations, promises made to men with titles, and threats disguised as counsel. Each line she decoded relentlessly tightened the knot around her grandfather's truth. When the fog lay thick on the bayou, Celeste moved through the plantation like a shadow with a ledger in her hand. She had learned to listen to small things, the way a servant's laugh stopped short in certain rooms, the slight tilt of a portrait frame where hands had been rearranged, the whisper of footsteps that meant words better not be spoken aloud. On an old map folded inside a tobacco-stained ledger she found a notation that did not belong, a crude sketch marking a grove of ancient oaks, and adjacent to it, a place with no name. Under a moon that turned water to ink, she followed the map and found a burial ground carved from swamp, a place erased from the plantation's ledgers and absent from any public record. The markers there bore numbers, not names, crude slats worn grey and carved with digits that suggested a systematic accounting rather than grief. Some of the graves looked newly filled, the soil still unsettled, others were compressed into the ground as if there had been too many hands working too quickly. There were markers so small that they could only hide children, and others suspiciously like shallow pits where no proper rites had been performed. Celeste's mind catalogued each irregularity with clinical precision. Each discovery nudged her from suspicion into a structural understanding. This was not the work of a depraved individual acting in isolation, but the result of an institution's quiet logistics. The plantation had been organized into mechanisms, accounts, labor, ritual, that concealed violence under the language of necessity. If this was empire's arithmetic, then someone had done the sums with a cruelty so ordinary it passed for policy. Her father's recent entries, hastily hidden in a ledger, contained a cipher of names and payments. Even in absence they spoke transfers to men with titles, payments for silence, entries that matched the dates of disappearances. As she traced those lines, the edges of her grief sharpened into a plan. She began to compose letters, copies stashed away and folded into the hems of dresses, addressed to editors and to judges in New Orleans. An insurance of words should her person fail. As autumn tightened its grip, men began to arrive in the hush between dusk and dawn, figures who moved like ratified secrets. There were physicians who knew how to make deaths look like disease, judges who could let ink erase a man's reputation, and military men whose networks threaded through the war's silent marketplaces. They were the society's tools and witnesses, and they gathered at Belmont as if they were attending a sacrament. In private, they called the arrangement a preservation, aloud they called it destiny. Celeste learned the names of those who would officiate and record men with licenses to be both validator and abettor. She understood then that this was a conspiracy that had learned to move in daylight under a series of polite euphemisms. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The announcement of the wedding date landed like a gavel. Cornelius selected a basement chamber for the ceremony, a stone room carved into the belly of the house where candles would flicker against symbols etched into masonry. He spoke of sanctity. The society supplied the sanctifiers. Letters of protest arrived, subtle and formal, from other families, but they were the kind of resistance that could be set aside by a signed affidavit or bought off by an uncomfortable favor. The plantation itself seemed to shift into the geometry of a ritual, rooms rearranged, servants given new orders, people moved like pieces on a board. Celeste observed each movement as she had learned to observe her own heartbeat. She cultivated patience as if it were a weapon. She continued to carve out a quiet archive. More letters, hidden copies, testimony written in places certain people would never think to look. She also prepared for a different kind of answer. There is a line between exposing corruption and survival. She intended to bridge both. She rebuilt the idea of revenge in her mind as a ledger of scales. If the society would weigh life and death as equations, then she would become an accountant of consequences. She would not become myth in their mouths. She would be proof and penalty rolled into one. Her preparations were not theatrical. They were practical, small actions stacked, until they could no longer be ignored. At night she whispered names into the dark and folded them into envelopes destined to travel beyond the plantation elsewhere. The days before the marriage moved like a slow, deliberate page turn. Celeste learned the choreography of compliance, how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to laugh with a measured lightness when men complimented her, how to allow hands to brush her sleeve and then withdraw as if startled. She wore her grandmother's silk with pockets sewn into hidden seams, and she memorized the pattern of the house so thoroughly that she could travel it blind. Outsiders saw a young woman stepping into a role, an obedient heiress offering herself to duty. Those who knew the ledger saw something else, a deliberate mask. Within the staff, a few trusted faces kept watch. Older women who had tended the herb plots and knew the remedies that healed and those that ended things. Celeste consulted them in private, but not for recipes or for the kind of instruction that would teach harm. She sought knowledge of old cures only as cover, a way to move through the garden without raising suspicion. She used the garden as a library. Its stems and roots were notes in a language she did not intend to read aloud to anyone. The society's members rehearsed their roles with the same clinical calm as Cornelius, and in every rehearsal the dancing of the plantation staff fell into place. There were subtle tests of loyalty, a bottle placed on a table and removed again, a letter left where only certain eyes could find it. Those who obeyed were rewarded. Those who hesitated were quietly reassigned. The legal machinery, too, whispered its complicity. A judge prepared papers that would render the marriage incontestable. A physician prepared a certificate of wellness that would smooth any future scrutiny. The mathematics of legitimacy were being adjusted until the marriage could withstand daylight scrutiny. The plantation's own theology, blood, inheritance, duty, was being rewritten to justify an act that normal law would name an atrocity. Celeste watched that theology being recited and felt rage turn into a narrowed, cold intelligence. She did not want to become a martyr in their ledger. She wanted them to be accountable both in print and in consequence. That dual aim would be the art of her retaliation, expose the network and collapse the system that enabled it. She gathered evidence and witnesses like coins, little holdings that together might purchase the verdict she could not buy alone. October morning broke with a chill that pressed the world flat. The household moved with an efficiency that obscured motive, chairs arranged, candles trimmed, black silk smoothed. Men who had lived by networks of privilege took seats in a darkened basement chamber, their faces pitched into the pool of candlelight like actors waiting for the word that would make them complicit. Cornelius entered like a man who had always been entitled to the air. His steps carried the weight of legacy and the indifference of someone who had turned cruelty into a kind of stewardship. The ceremony itself was an exercise in the rearrangement of terms, marriage, duty, and inheritance braided into a sentence that swallowed both law and conscience. Celeste moved with a poise that was practiced. She intoned her vows in a voice that betrayed nothing. Around them, the society observed ritual and procedure, recording and validating. A physician kept a quiet watch. A judge took notes that could later become the spine of legal paperwork. A captain who had moved men and goods through wartime routes held the door, as if to keep community outside. Yet beneath the ceremony's formal language, a different ledger was being read. Celeste had prepared carefully. She had folded testimony and copies into places no one would think to search, and she had set in motion a number of small, inevitable consequences that would nudge the society's own machinery to betray them. The words she spoke were the bait. The proof she had hidden would be the hook. In the hush after the vows, there was a moment when the room inhaled, the silence stratified into layers of expectation and dread. That breath was the thin membrane between plan and outcome. Celeste felt the entire room as if it were a body whose pulse she could learn to predict. She pressed against the membrane with a steadiness that felt like prayer in its intensity, and then she carried on with the performance as if nothing at all had shifted. The men who sat at the perimeter believed they had witnessed a settling of an old account. What they had actually witnessed was the closing of one chapter in a book that Celeste had already begun to write in secret. Outside, the plantation seemed to listen, trees leaning like watchers inside. The covenant of silence tightened more tightly like a noose and older. The days that followed the ceremony unspooled like a sickness. Men who had attended the rite complained of malaise, fevers that rose and broke unpredictably, and some did not wake to see the dawn. Rumors of an ailment moved faster than explanations. Those who had influence found ways to keep the deaths buried in private parlors, citing exhaustion or lingering war-borne afflictions. But the pattern was too tight to be coincidence. A set of men linked by the society, each present at the same dark hour, each felled within a narrow span of time. Words that had been sealed in envelopes and shoved into trunks found daylight when trusted hands did as Celeste had planned. Carriages moving to New Orleans, letters received by editors who smelled scandal and made the right kinds of inquiries. Celeste watched as threads she had placed in motion began to pull. The legal documents the society relied upon were suddenly vulnerable signatures that had been supposed to sanctify now read like a confession. Witnesses who had ratted in whisper began to remember things clearly, and a map of payments and favors surfaced that tied the deaths and disappearances to a system of exchange. Cornelius, who had believed himself insulated by blood and custom, felt the air change around him. He tried to manipulate the narrative, averring that the deaths were unrelated, that his granddaughter was a sacrament of duty, that the charters allowed him to act as patriarchal steward. But the network he relied upon was fraying. Men who kept silence for convenience found that their convenience had become the weapon that could cut them. The newspapers in New Orleans published accounts that refused to bow to the polite euphemisms of plantation society. Editors printed names and notations. Clerks in distant offices began to pull ledgers. For the first time in the plantation's history, the machinery that protected Belmont faced an external scrutiny that could not be bought off with a check or a signature. Celeste did not celebrate the suffering that unfolded. She recognized it as the arithmetic of justice, an ugly balance being struck between crime and consequence. Her letters had not been pleas, they were detonations in the right places, and the bodies around Cornelius started to become part of the evidence he could not control. He moved through the house like a man discovering the geography of his failures. Frantic and alone, Cornelius's composure cracked in private. He paced halls while portraits watched and whispered to himself in a voice that used to dispatch orders. He began to threaten, to promise retribution in a language that was both legal and savage. Officials who had been quiet began to feel the heat of public curiosity where once their pens had rewritten facts. Now their signatures might be subpoenaed. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. As the plantation's defenders grew desperate, they became less careful. Errors multiplied, a ledger misfiled, a servant's confession overheard by a neighbor, a letter left where a curious child might find it and run. The trial that followed, if trial it could be called, did not unfold on a single day but in the slow, sifting processes of witnesses changing their voices and records turning up in unexpected drawers. Celeste watched it all with a teacher's patience, marking which men turned pale when certain names were spoken and which men still tried to laugh at fate. The society's spokesman argued that tradition requires exceptions, that the law should account for lineage. They spoke in a rhetoric designed to soothe and to justify. But rhetoric is porous in the face of documented transactions: who paid whom, when, and for what. When a judge's hand betrayed a trembling while signing, the illusion of control disintegrated. Cornelius lashed out in fits of rage, ordering things that made the plantation feel like a besieged fortress. He punished servants who had shown sympathy for Celeste, sent men to keep the grounds in a state of constant vigilance, and pulled old favors out of drawers to see if any alley remained. But alliances had a cost, and the cost was now visible. Where loyalty had once been a purchase, it was now a liability. As each layer peeled back, the scale of Belmont's crimes became visible enough to be catalogued in public sheets. Celeste's letters had spread beyond editors, into religious leaders who demanded inquiry, into magistrates who could not ignore a pattern. The house that had once protected a dynasty became the stage for its unmaking. She felt no triumph in their disintegration. Instead, she felt a clearing, as if a room long filled with smoke finally opened to wind. This was not about vengeance alone, it was about stopping a system that had normalized atrocity. Cornered, Cornelius's tactics shifted from legal maneuvers to raw control. He attempted to erase records, to burn what could be charred, and to intimidate what could not. He summoned men from his past debts and old favors, offering more to seal mouths than the law might cost him. He also targeted the living. Threats implied in hushed rooms, overt in sudden orders that sent some staff away under pretexts of relocation. He tried to move Celeste, to put distance between her and the witnesses she had gathered. But distance is not a remedy when the evidence exists in multiple hands and in the public domain. His fury made him sloppy. In one violent fit, he smashed a set of ledgers he thought incriminating, unaware that copies existed in the folds of clothing he had ordered cleaned and straightened earlier that week. Those copies then traveled by carriage and river, arriving in offices where they would be read by men whose livelihoods depended on truth, not favor. Public servants who had once been complacent found themselves facing questions, favors were recounted, debts were detailed, and men who had traded silence for comfort began to inscribe their recollections in trembling hands. Cornelius felt the floor fall away beneath him and, in his panic, made a miscalculation that would prove decisive. He attempted to silence one of the few remaining servants who had spoken too freely. The attempt failed, not because of luck but because the servant had allies, neighbors who had noticed strange things and who now feared what might happen if they did not act. The community around Belmont, long accustomed to looking away, found its conscience jarred by successive revelations. A small coalition of local men and women, clergy and merchants whose businesses had little to gain from the society's secrets, stepped forward to testify. Their courage transformed rumor into formal accusation, and the net Cornelius had woven to keep power within his lines became a trap that tightened with each new admission. Cornelius's isolation became absolute. Men who had eaten at his table now crossed the street to avoid his gaze. The plantations' fields, once murmurous with labor, turned quiet as workers watched for signs of unrest. Celeste, meanwhile, did not gloat. She wrote lists of names to be called, organized testimonies into sequences, and prepared to stand when the court finally required her presence for history to witness. A hearing convened at a county seat that had once been indifferent to Belmont's machinations. The courtroom smelled of dust and ink, of leather, bound law, and the faint trace of spent tobacco. At first, the proceedings were procedural objections, motions, and a slow sifting of admissible material. Cornelius's counsel argued technicalities, appealed to tradition, and called witnesses who would frame the marriage as a lawful preservation of estate. The society's claims rang hollow next to written payments and transcribed confessions. Photographs did not exist for many of the victims, but letters, receipts, and multiple independent attestations began to form a lattice strong enough to bear the weight of an accusation. Celeste presented her documents not as a layman, but as a ledger of truth, copies of entries that mapped the flow of money, names of those who had been paid to stay silent, and testimony gathered from neighbors who had previously been too frightened to speak. Her voice in the courtroom was steady. The same composure that had allowed her to perform during the marriage now served as a weapon of clarity. The public, fed by newspapers that printed pages of the evidence, began to feel something like outrage. Men who once met in the society's shadow now found their reputations frayed. Some attempted to bargain. Offers of land, rescinded debts, threats thinly veiled as counsel, but legal remedies began to press where social ones had once smoothed the way. Families who had long benefited from Belmont's silence now weighed the cost of continued complicity. The hearing was not a dramatic single-day spectacle. It was a slow erosion of influence, a legal attrition that uncovered how far corruption had been organized. Yet even as laws pressed and papers proved, there remained those who argued that the traditions of lineage could not be so readily undone. The tension between custom and law, between old privilege and new accountability, played out in every exchange. Celeste's role became emblematic, a pivot between hidden horrors and the public record that might finally hold them to account. Outside the courthouse, crowds murmured, some brought flowers, others curses. Priests read statements, merchants signed petitions, and a few men tried to intimidate witnesses, but met with communal refusal. The slow machinery of justice turned, not perfectly, but sufficiently to unsettle dynasties built on secret ledgers and private violence. It was as if conscience finally found a public voice. The hearings peeled back not just Cornelius's acts, but the scaffolding that had held him. Testimony revealed patterns that stretched beyond Belmont, transactions moving through the hands of judges and merchants, clergy who had turned a blind eye, and captains who had facilitated the society's quiet moves. The case became less about a single marriage and more about an entire economy of secrecy. That realization made the story contagious. Other families felt the light and began to protect themselves by making their own accounts public, hoping to outrun scandal by disclosing small sins before they could be used as leverage. The legal process was ugly and slow, depositions that dragged on for hours, men who refused to remember, other men who remembered too well. Cornelius's allies dwindled as each ally calculated the risk of remaining faithful. He attempted an escape across the river, a plan hatched in desperation and fueled by panic. But his movements were intercepted by men who had decided that enough was enough. Arrest did not feel like a relief, it felt like a condemnation made official. In the cell that had once been an office of ledgers and ink, Cornelius had time to think, and his thoughts turned inward to the mechanics of what he had done. He tried to construct reasons, necessity, preservation, the burden of legacy, but they sounded thin in a room that did not accept rhetoric as evidence. Celeste, watching the man who had tried to make her an instrument, felt a shift inside her that was more than satisfaction. She felt a metamorphosis. The woman who had been led by records now found herself the author of them. Her identity, once fused to the lineage she had inherited, began to separate into something new. She could be heir and witness, keeper and reformer. That possibility was at once terrifying and liberating. The community that had once hidden the society's sins now faced a choice: rebuild through truthful reckoning or reconstitute power through quiet agreements. The choice would mark the next generation's map. Religious leaders called for reparations, merchants demanded audits, and local councils debated measures to prevent a repeat. Trials spilled into public squares as people argued about lineage and law, about whether ancient customs could justify modern crimes. In conversations at kitchen tables, people began to imagine a different order where secrecy no longer served the powerful and accountability became plausible. In the months that followed, Belmont's name was written into court reports and editorial columns. The scandal forced administrations to examine charters and deeds across many estates, and some counties moved to seal similar provisions that had allowed patriarchal excess to masquerade as custom. Cornelius's trial concluded not with an easy spectacle, but with verdicts that varied across counts and jurisdictions, convictions where the evidence met the legal bar, and lingering questions where proof could not travel. In custody, Cornelius's resolve dimmed. He grew thin in a way that seemed to betray both age and shame. His last days were a private unspooling, a man who had tightened his world until only his obsessions remained. Whether his end was natural or the result of the many forces he'd set in motion, the record shows a conclusion amiable to neither him nor the community he had tried to command. Celeste's role in everything that unfolded was complex and double-edged. She had engineered exposure and enacted consequences, but in doing so she had also become a figure who carried the weight of those who had died or been erased. She could not unmake the lives lost at Belmont, and she knew the truth. Justice does not restore, it only reckons. There were nights when regret visited her, when she thought of names carved on wooden markers with no epitaphs, of children whose stories had been swallowed by time. But she also saw the other side, a community beginning to insist that ledgers be opened, that laws be subject to scrutiny, and that public record should not be the exclusive property of those with silver medallions. In the slow rebuilding that followed, some of Belmont's holdings were redistributed, not all to the hands one might imagine, but enough that the plantation's power was diminished. Celeste used influence where she could to place trusted stewards in positions that would not allow secrecy to thrive. Her inheritance became, in part, a tool for restructuring the systems that had enabled the past. She founded workshops where women and former servants could learn bookkeeping and legal literacy. She encouraged local councils to publish meeting minutes and made anonymous complaint channels for workers. These measures were imperfect, contested, and paternal in places, but they were the beginnings of institutional pressure that made secrecy harder. Mechanisms replaced mysteries, audits, public registers, and regular reporting, and slowly shifted social incentives. The story of Belmont did not end with a court decree or property settlement. It lived in the region's bone and speech. For some, the events marked a necessary correction; for others, a shaming of tradition. Belmont's defenders wrote private pamphlets arguing that customs had been misunderstood and that history would judge them more kindly with time. Families touched by the scandal scattered, some seeking refuge in anonymity, others trying to recast their names in new places. But the forces Celeste had set in motion continued to ripple. Workshop graduates taught others the basics of account keeping, and the habit of asking public questions became a modest civic practice. The audacity of one woman's letters had inspired a habit of documentation, and documentation breeds accountability in ways private vows do not. Celeste herself became a figure of contradiction, a woman who wielded the very things that had once bound her. She counseled local officials one day, and at another she sat quietly beside a grieving family listening. She learned that power could be allocated without replicating the violence that birthed it. Yet the cost remained. Old loyalties die slowly. Men who had grown up believing in the sanctity of lineage sought new ways to perpetuate influence. Some rebranded their networks as charities, others moved into commerce, and a few emigrated with their rituals intact. The Guardian Society did not vanish in a single night. It adapted and mutated, as organizations do when under threat. The fight, then, was never over. It had shifted from explosive revelation to long-term maintenance, a steady practice of oversight, a cultural insistence that secrecy must be disputed. Celeste regarded that work with a kind of grim resolve. She had broken a pattern, but she now had to help build institutions that would keep the break from closing into another form of domination. In quiet hours, she wrote memoirs she never meant to publish, diaries that catalogued strategy and sorrow. They served as a map for successors, not a manual of revenge, but notes on the architecture of secrecy, the weak joints where corruption could be pried open. She met clergy and schoolmasters to urge curricula in civic duty, and pushed for public archives so records could not be private currency. Critics saw ambition, others saw a necessary reckoning. The work was slow, stubborn, and uneven, but it began to reframe what power might mean. Stories have a way of transmuting fact into moral currency. Within a few years, the Belmont story took on the qualities of local fable. Whispered warnings told to children, confidences passed in church vestibules, gossip that hardened into lesson. Where once there had been ledger and law, a new vocabulary emerged. Phrases like "watch the ledgers" or "keep the doors open," that carried the memory of what had almost been concealed. Travelers who passed through the parish heard the tale and left with a shiver. Ministers used parts of the story in sermons about accountability, and a few playwrights in New Orleans turned fragments into scenes that invited audiences to confront histories they preferred to forget. Belmont itself became a site of moral pilgrimage for some and a symbol of bitter loss for others. Visitors would stand beneath the live oaks where the unsigned graves lay and feel a kind of unsettled communion with absence. The plantation's ruin, once a private scandal, had become a public relic that refused to be sanitized by fashionable recollection. Celeste resisted the hero's mantle when it was offered. She preferred the honesty of a ledger to the sentimentality of statue and plaque. But she understood the value of narrative. Stories make institutions legible and thus accountable. She cultivated memory deliberately, encouraging the recording of events so that future generations would inherit a history that taught scrutiny instead of reverence. In private, she sometimes watched the faces of those who came to see Belmont and thought about what it meant to be seen. Seeing, she had learned, changes people. To be observed is to be answerable. The Guardian Society did not vanish, it receded and reappeared in other guises. Charitable committees, closed clubs, commercial syndicates. Once, exalted rituals moved into new forms, but with less claim to moral immunity, because the light had been shown into corners they once considered private. Celeste observed these shifts with the same care she had given to records, knowing power adapts and oversight must persist. Town meetings required minutes. Schools taught basic legal literacy, and ordinary people who once kept their heads down began learning to ask questions. For those who listen to Belmont now, the warning is not only historical, it is personal. Identity can be altered by what we choose to remember and by habit. Not everyone welcomed the changes. There were those who believed that a return to tradition was the only antidote to chaos. They argued that lineage anchors society and that rupturing it would invite deterioration. Some of Belmont's old acquaintances worked to re-establish influence by other means. Strategic marriages in distant parishes, new loans that bound families together in fresh obligations, and the subtle exchange of favors under names that meant little to outsiders. For Celeste, these maneuvers were a reminder that dismantling a system is easier than building an alternative that is both just and durable. She found allies in unlikely places: a former overseer who had been forced to confront his own complicity, a clerk who had risked reputation to release records, and a small network of activists dedicated to civic education. But she also made enemies. Men who had once considered themselves untouchable watched their influence wane and plotted quieter forms of retaliation: legal harassment, economic pressure, and social ostracism designed to erode the will of reformers. The toll on Celeste was personal. She lost friendships that had been built on convenience, and the intimacy of her youth was compromised by the responsibilities she now carried. Even victories tasted of ash, property redistributed, policies enacted, and still the hollow places where names were gone remained. She learned to carry loss like an old cloak, its weight part of her armor, but also its burden. In private moments she questioned whether the ledger she had created would outlast the human tendencies that had necessitated it. Reform requires maintenance, she knew, otherwise the old currents of secrecy simply find new channels. She learned to live with complexity. Governing responsibly required tedious fidelity, regular audits, published ledgers, and meetings that recorded objections. She argued for transparent accounts and convinced reluctant men to accept small burdens in exchange for structural protections. She financed restitution programs for harmed families using estate surplus and private donations she convinced skeptics to release. Critics accused her of seeking power. She accepted the critique because the alternative was inertia. Success, she decided, would not be a monument, but the quiet accumulation of safeguards, records maintained, names acknowledged, grievances heard and acted upon. It demanded patience and the courage to repurpose influence toward accountability rather than spectacle, a daily discipline against erasure, and to train future guardians. Time tempered the immediacy of scandal, but it did not erase the memory of what had happened at Belmont. Laws were revised in places, registries were made more transparent, small courts acquired clearer standards for oversight. These were not miracles but practical adjustments: deadlines for producing records, penalties for concealment, and public registries that made private charters harder to wield as weapons. Economic incentives shifted slowly. Mercantile houses that once relied on opaque transactions now found benefit in clean accounts, and a new generation of clerks and auditors found steady work. Yet the human elements that permit secrecy, fear, loyalty, and the hunger for advantage did not vanish. They learned new languages. Some adapted to commerce, others migrated their rituals into subtler patronage. The structural changes Celeste and others helped create reduced opportunities for secret atrocities, but could not eradicate human cunning. Celeste herself grew into a different embodiment, less a girl of lineage and more a steward of public memory. She aged into responsibilities that did not offer quiet repose. She bore the ongoing weight of having known and acted. Her evenings were sometimes restless with worry for the future. She worried that the measures she instituted would be co-opted by those she had once opposed. She also took solace in small, tangible signs: a teacher using a public ledger for instruction, a council meeting where a woman from the workhouse spoke and was heard, a child reading aloud the names of those once buried without ceremony. Those moments felt like proof that work can alter the arc of a community's practice. Yet she remained vigilant. History had taught her that any failure to maintain accountability risks a return to shadows. She established an archive funded by the estate and insisted on open access, a repository where ledgers, letters, and testimony could be preserved. She endowed scholarships for local youth to study law and accounting so more people could guard public processes. She convened councils that included those excluded from power, insisting oversight must be inclusive. In public addresses she spoke plainly: memory without action is superstition, action without memory repeats it. She urged listeners to keep records, challenge secrecy, and hold institutions accountable through daily work of fairness. Her legacy combined restitution, reform, and a perpetual call for vigilance. Even as she aged, she wrote letters insisting future generations not to forget the ordinary mechanisms that daily enable truth. In her later years, Celeste returned often to the grove where the unnamed markers stood. She walked the footpaths alone, pressing her palm to weathered wood and speaking names aloud, names that had been carved into private memory and now deserved public sound. She led simple ceremonies with the people who had survived, with descendants who now felt a claim to story, and with school children who had learned about civic duty in crisp notebooks. There was no grandeur in these rites, only an insistence that presence mattered, that acknowledging absence is a preliminary act of repair. She also visited the descendants of those who had been wronged, helping to trace titles and reclaim property where law allowed. The practical work of reparation was slow and often incomplete, but it marked a change in posture from concealment to restitution. Even surrounded by these acts, Celeste remained ambivalent. She had broken a cycle, yes, but the break required constant tending lest it gape and sew itself shut with new forms of dominance. Her vigilance was not theatrical. It took the form of meetings, of letters, of quiet phone calls in which she urged an official to publish a record or a minister to record a name. The smallness of this work belied its importance. Over time, more names were reclaimed, more graves marked with proper epitaphs, and the community grew used to the presence of truth in its public life. Celeste's presence at the grove became a ritual in itself, a living, fallible memory who refused to let others pronounce the final word on history. She lived long enough to see patterns change, not perfectly, but irreversibly in some places. Her story, like the oak roots, wound itself under the soil of the region and emerged in ways she could not fully predict. There were costs. She endured slights, nights of loneliness in a house that had been cradle and cage, and the loss of comforts that come with silence. She accepted responsibility that required compromise. Yet small joys appeared: a teacher's letter about a student refusing to hide injustice, a former servant securing a plot of land, children learning the names of the lost. These returns tethered her to hope. Her life asks a hard question of those who hear it: is identity given by birth or made by the choices we take to heal or harm and keep faith? Decades passed and the map of the region changed yet again. Belmont's mansion weathered storms and stood like a relic, half museum, half private ruin. Some rooms were open to visitors, others remained locked, preserved in a manner of respect or fear. The plantation's land was parceled differently, and while some tracts returned to cultivation, other corners grew back into marsh and thicket where the ground held its own memory. The story of what transpired there became part of a larger regional conscience, a reminder of how institutional secrecy can intertwine with law, religion, and commerce to produce horrors that endure. New civic groups formed, watchdogs who audited local charities and societies, committees that insisted on public reporting, and historical associations committed to preserving records rather than heroizing the past. Those initiatives were uneven and contested, but they made it harder for families to set private terms above public accountability. Yet the more the surface of governance changed, the more subterranean currents adjusted. Networks of influence migrated into new sectors, into rail and trade, into banking relationships and philanthropic ventures. The lessons of Belmont were not perfect inoculations, they were influences. The region learned to treat certain customs with suspicion, to demand documentation where once trust had sufficed, and to question the narratives that sanctified lineage. The moral calculus people used daily had shifted toward an expectation of evidence. That shift altered lives. Managers who once assumed privacy now planned with public review in mind, and young people grew into professional roles that valued transparency. Nevertheless, the interplay between privilege and secrecy remained a moving target, requiring constant civic attention and cultural reinforcement. Forbidden histories like Belmont's became case studies in how power bends narrative. Scholars investigated similar cases, tracking patterns across parishes and beyond. They found the same structures: private charters, discreet societies, complicit professionals, repeating in new guises. Those studies guided reformers and journalists pressing for legal clarity and ethics. Celeste's archive was primary material for many inquiries, a collection that helped reconstruct how secrecy functioned. The archive's public presence meant concealment was harder, but it also made knowledge available to new generations who might use it well or poorly. The lesson endured, revealing suppressed truth is necessary, but guardianship of that truth requires constant vigilance against repurposing. Community institutions adopted practices to rotate oversight and to involve diverse voices, reducing the risk that power could again calcify into secrecy permanently. When Celeste's final days came, they were quiet and dignified, marked by visitors who came not to praise but to bear witness. She did not die as a saint nor as a villain. She died as someone who had acted in a morally fraught world and attempted to make a better structure for the next people who would live within it. Eulogies were mixed, with gratitude, with regret, and with demand for continuity. The archive she had left behind continued to draw researchers and citizens, and her work, both its successes and failures, became part of curricula and campaigns for transparency. Some families kept their shame, others sought reconciliation, and a few still held on to private rituals, though now they did so with less impunity. The region retained a memory of Belmont's crimes and of the accountability process that followed, not as a tidy moral but as a complicated precedent. Young people raised in the altered civic culture learned to keep records and to question private power, and in time some of them became the public stewards who maintained oversight institutions. The story, like any story, was not a prescription but a mirror. It reflected human tendencies toward secrecy and toward reform. You who listen now are part of that mirror. The choices a community makes about transparency and remembrance are active decisions that shape identity across generations. Celeste's life shows that individual resolve can catalyze change, but lasting reform requires communal habits, laws, and the willingness of people to keep each other accountable, even when doing so is uncomfortable. Look at the institutions around you and ask which things are private out of necessity and which are private out of convenience. Consider who benefits from silence and who pays its toll. Belmont shows that suppressed truths can harden into systems that outlive their makers, and that privilege will adapt unless public practices prevent it. If you carry this story forward, do so humbly, treat history as both warning and guide, and convert insight into steady habits of oversight. Preserve records, demand transparency where secrecy is unnecessary, and make room for names previously erased from public account. Resist the slow normalization of atrocity, not with spectacle but with daily governance, paperwork, testimony, community watchfulness, and the tedious work of accountability. That is how a community keeps its soul. Let refusal to hide become a practice. Let memory be active and civic. If this story sinks into you, let it change the shape of your attention. The Belmont tale is not merely a curiosity of a bygone age, it is an anatomy of how private rights, legal language, and institutional complicity conspire to make atrocity palatable. Cornelius believed lineage justified acts that law and conscience condemned. He tied custom to cruelty until the two were indistinguishable. Celeste, by contrast, turned lineage into responsibility. She showed that inheritance could be reimagined as a burden to be borne with transparency, rather than as a license to hide. Her life demonstrates the paradox at the heart of reform. It often requires the same tools once used to oppress, wealth, influence, and legal savvy redirected toward public good. That redirection is precarious. Institutions will always be tempted to protect themselves. Communities will always struggle between reverence for continuity and the need for correction. The work we inherit from stories like Belmont is slow, repetitive, and sometimes thankless. It is the daily insistence on records, the refusal to let silence do the work of power, the insistence that names be spoken and rights recognized. If identity can be reformed by what a person chooses to protect or expose, then each of us holds a small but meaningful role in shaping history's tilt. So listen closely when you encounter secrecy dressed as tradition, question it. When private language appears to be law, hold it to the light. The haunt of the past is not merely to frighten us, it is to instruct. Remember the live oaks and the numbered markers at Belmont, and let those images serve as a cautionary geometry. In the end, the plantation's ghosts were not the most important thing. The living were, those who had been erased and those who refused to remain silent. If you carry anything away from this tale, carry the hard work of remembrance, and let it shape how you guard the institutions in your own life. The moss still hangs heavy in that place, and the wind moves through branches as if sifting through pages. Belmont stones remember what men wanted to hide, the town remembers what others refused to keep quiet. Your attention is an archive. Keep records. Tell the truth where you can, hold institutions to account where you must, and teach others to do the same. In that quiet persistence lies the safeguard against history repeating itself.